Sarah Martinez wiped down the last table of her shift and looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight, and her feet hurt from walking around the restaurant for 10 hours straight. She had been working at the Golden Crown restaurant for 3 years now, and every night felt the same. Rich people came in, ate expensive food, and left big tips without really looking at her face. The Golden Crown was not like other restaurants. It sat on the fancy Upper East Side of Manhattan, where only wealthy people could afford to eat. The walls were covered with gold paint, and crystal lights hung from the ceiling. Every table had white cloth and real silver. The people who came here wore expensive clothes and talked about money like it was nothing. Sarah picked up the dirty plates and glasses from table 12. A man in a $1,000 suit had left his credit card bill on the table. The total was more than Sarah made in a week. She sighed and carried the dishes to the kitchen. This was her life now, but it was not the life she had dreamed of. 5 years ago, Sarah had been a student at Juilliard, one of the best music schools in the world. She had played piano since she was 6 years old. Her mother worked 2 jobs to pay for piano lessons, and Sarah practiced every day after school. She was good, really good. Her teachers said she could become a famous concert pianist one day, but dreams cost money, and Sarah's family did not have much. When her mother got sick during Sarah's 3rd year at Juilliard, Sarah had to make a choice. She could finish school and let her mother worry about the medical bills, or she could quit school and get a job to help pay for everything. Sarah chose her family. She dropped out of Juilliard and got a job waiting tables. The student loan she had taken out still needed to be paid back, even though she never finished her degree. Every month she sent most of her money to the loan company and to help her mother with the medical bills. There was not much left over for herself. Now, 3 years later, Sarah lived in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn. It was so small that her bed was also her couch, and her kitchen was just a hot plate and a small fridge. But in one corner of the room, she had managed to fit an old upright piano. It was not a good piano. Some of the keys stuck, and it was never perfectly in tune, but it was hers, and she played it every night when she came home from work. Sarah changed out of her work clothes and sat down at the piano. Her fingers found the keys like they were old friends. She started to play a piece by Chopin that she had learned at Juilliard. The music filled her small apartment and made her forget about her tired feet and the rude customers and the bills that were always waiting to be paid. She closed her eyes and remembered what it felt like to perform on stage. At Juilliard, she had played in front of hundreds of people. They would sit in silence and listen to every note. When she finished, they would clap and sometimes even stand up. For those few minutes on stage, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. But that was the past. Now she played only for herself in her tiny apartment. Sometimes her neighbors would bang on the walls if she played too late, but most of the time they did not seem to mind. Maybe they enjoyed the music too, even if they never said anything. The Golden Crown had a piano too. It was a beautiful black Steinway grand piano that cost more than most people's cars. It sat in the corner of the main dining room, and Sarah walked past it dozens of times every shift. Sometimes, when the restaurant was empty, she would stop and look at it. She would imagine sitting down and playing for all the rich customers, but she never touched it. That piano was just for decoration, and she was just a waitress. The restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, was a thin man who always wore dark suits and never smiled. He treated the waiters and waitresses like they were invisible. He cared only about making the customers happy, so they would spend more money. Sarah had worked for him for 3 years, and he had never asked her about her life or her dreams. To him, she was just another person who brought food to tables. The customers were not much better. They talked about their expensive vacations and their big houses while Sarah poured their wine. They complained if their food was not perfect or if she was not fast enough with their drinks. Most of them never said thank you or please. They acted like Sarah was a robot, not a real person with feelings and dreams. But Sarah needed this job. The tips were good because the food was so expensive. On a busy night, she could make $200 in tips. That money helped pay for her apartment and her student loans and her mother's medicine. She could not afford to quit, even though every day felt like a little piece of her music was dying. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, Sarah would look at old photos from Juilliard. She kept them in a box under her bed, along with her concert programs and the reviews from newspapers when she had performed in student concerts. One review said she had extraordinary talent and a bright future in classical music. Reading that review now made her want to cry. Her old classmates from Juilliard were all doing what they had dreamed of. Some played in orchestras, some gave private lessons to rich kids, and some even had recording contracts. Sarah followed them on social media, watching their success from far away. She was happy for them, but it also hurt to see what her life could have been. Every morning, Sarah woke up and made the same choice. She could feel sorry for herself, or she could keep working and keep playing piano at night. She chose to keep going. Maybe someday things would change. Maybe someday she would get another chance to show the world what she could do with a piano. But until then, she would serve food to rich people and play music for herself. The clock in her apartment showed 1:30 in the morning. Sarah played one more song, a slow and sad piece that matched how she felt. Then she closed the piano and went to bed. Tomorrow would be another day at the Golden Crown, another day of being invisible. But tonight, for just a little while, she had been a musician again. Friday evening at the Golden Crown was always busy, but this Friday was special. Sarah could tell something was different as soon as she walked into work. The dining room had been decorated with fresh flowers that cost more than her monthly rent. Extra security guards stood by the door, and the usual tables had been moved around to make space for one long table in the center of the room. Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, was more nervous than Sarah had ever seen him. He kept checking his watch and straightening his tie. He had called all the staff into a meeting before the restaurant opened. "Tonight is the most important night of the year for this restaurant," he said in his serious voice. "We are hosting the annual Metropolitan Charity Foundation dinner. These are some of the richest and most powerful people in New York City. If we do a good job tonight, they will keep coming back and bringing their friends. If we mess up, we could lose millions of dollars in future business." He looked at each waiter and waitress with sharp eyes. "I want perfect service tonight. No mistakes, no dropped plates, no spilled drinks. These people are used to the best of everything, and that is what we will give them." Sarah nodded along with the other servers. She had served rich people before, but apparently these were the richest of the rich. The guest list was like reading the business section of the newspaper. There was David Chen, the young tech billionaire who had started 3 different companies before he turned 30. Victoria Ashworth was coming too. She owned art galleries around the world and had enough money to buy entire museums. But the person Sarah was most excited to see was Eleanor Whitman. Eleanor was known for supporting classical music. She had given millions of dollars to help young musicians and had her own concert hall. Sarah had read about her in music magazines. Eleanor had discovered several famous pianists when they were just starting their careers. As the evening began, Sarah watched the guests arrive. They came in expensive cars that cost more than most people made in several years. The men wore suits that were custom-made, and the women had jewelry that sparkled under the crystal lights. They all looked comfortable and confident, like they belonged in this world of luxury. Sarah's job tonight was to serve drinks and appetizers. She moved between the guests with a silver tray, offering champagne and small pieces of food that the chef had spent hours preparing. The conversations she heard were unlike anything at her regular tables. These people talked about buying companies like other people talked about buying groceries. They discussed donating money to build new hospitals and schools. One woman was planning to give away $10 million to help homeless people. At table 7 sat an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes. Sarah recognized him right away, even though she tried not to show it. Professor James Morrison was a famous composer and conductor. He had written music that orchestras around the world still played. Sarah had studied his work at Juilliard and had always dreamed of playing one of his piano pieces in concert. When Sarah offered him champagne, Professor Morrison smiled and said thank you. Most of the other guests did not even look at her when she served them, but he was different. He treated her like a real person, not just someone who brought him drinks. As the evening went on, Sarah noticed that something was wrong. The restaurant was supposed to have live music during dinner. A professional pianist was hired to play background music while the guests ate. But the piano in the corner sat silent and empty. Mr. Thompson kept looking at the piano and checking his phone. Sarah could see he was worried. During a quiet moment, she heard him talking to his assistant manager. "The pianist called in sick an hour ago," Mr. Thompson said in a stressed voice. "I have called everyone I know, but it is too late to find a replacement. These people expect live music with their dinner. This is going to ruin everything." Sarah's heart started beating faster. She looked at the beautiful black piano sitting empty in the corner. She had walked past it every day for 3 years, never touching it, never imagining she would get a chance to play it. The idea that came into her head was crazy, but she could not stop thinking about it. The guests were seated for dinner now. The first course was served and conversation filled the room. But Sarah could see that some people kept looking at the silent piano. They had expected music and its absence was noticed. At table 7, Professor Morrison was talking to David Chen about the importance of music in education. Music feeds the soul, the professor said. It brings people together in ways that nothing else can. A good piece of music can change someone's entire day, even their entire life. Victoria Ashworth joined their conversation. I completely agree, she said. That is why I always have live music at my gallery openings. Art and music together create something magical. Eleanor Whitman nodded from across the table. Music has the power to touch hearts and open minds. It is sad that we do not have any tonight. This dinner would be perfect with some beautiful piano music in the background. Sarah was serving the second course when she heard Professor Morrison agree. You are absolutely right, Eleanor. There is nothing quite like live piano music to make an evening special. It is such a shame that young musicians today have so few opportunities to perform for appreciative audiences. As Sarah poured wine for the guests, her hands were shaking slightly. The idea in her head was getting stronger. She kept looking at the piano and then at the disappointed faces of the guests. These were people who loved music and supported young musicians. Professor Morrison himself had said that young musicians needed more opportunities to perform. Mr. Thompson was getting more worried as the evening went on. Sarah could see him talking on his phone in the corner, probably still trying to find a last-minute pianist. But it was Friday night, and any good musician would already have other plans. The main course was served, and the conversation at the tables was still lively. But Sarah noticed that the atmosphere was not quite what Mr. Thompson had hoped for. Without music, the dinner felt more like a business meeting than a special celebration. Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. During a moment when Mr. Thompson was not looking, she walked over to where he was standing and cleared her throat quietly. Excuse me, Mr. Thompson, she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I know this might sound strange, but I can play piano. If you want, I could play some background music for the guests. Mr. Thompson looked at her like she had said something in a foreign language. What are you talking about, Sarah? You are a waitress. I studied piano at Juilliard, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. I can play classical music, jazz, anything you want. I know you need someone, and I am here. Mr. Thompson shook his head. This is not the time for jokes, Sarah. These people expect professional quality music. But Professor Morrison had been walking by and heard part of their conversation. He stopped and looked at Sarah with interest. Did you say you studied at Juilliard? He asked. Sarah's face turned red when Professor Morrison asked about Juilliard. She had not meant for any of the guests to hear her conversation with Mr. Thompson. Now one of the most famous musicians in the world was looking at her and waiting for an answer. Yes, sir, Sarah said quietly. I studied there for 3 years before I had to leave. Professor Morrison's eyes became more interested. What did you study? Piano performance? Yes, sir. Classical piano performance. Sarah could barely believe she was having this conversation. I studied under Professor Chen Li in the classical department. Ah, Professor Chen Li, Professor Morrison said with a smile. She is an excellent teacher. Very demanding. If you studied with her, you must have real talent. Mr. Thompson looked confused and a little angry. He did not like his employees talking to the guests, especially about personal things. But he could not tell Professor Morrison to stop talking to Sarah. Professor Morrison, Mr. Thompson said with a forced smile. I am sorry that Sarah bothered you. She should be working, not talking about her hobbies. But Professor Morrison held up his hand. Please do not apologize. I am very interested in young musicians. He looked back at Sarah. Tell me, why did you leave Juilliard? Sarah did not want to talk about her personal problems in front of all these rich people, but Professor Morrison seemed genuinely interested and his kind eyes made her feel safe. My mother got sick, Sarah said simply. I needed to work to help pay for her medical bills and my student loans. Professor Morrison nodded with understanding. That is a difficult choice that too many young artists have to make. But you still play? Every night when I get home from work, Sarah said. I have a small piano in my apartment. By now, several other guests had noticed the conversation. Victoria Ashworth and Eleanor Whitman had walked over to see what was happening. David Chen was still sitting at the table, but Sarah could see he was listening too. "How long has it been since you performed for an audience?" Professor Morrison asked. 3 years, Sarah said. "Not since I left school." Eleanor Whitman stepped forward. She was an elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair and pearls around her neck. "What pieces did you use to perform?" Sarah felt like she was in a dream. 3 years ago, she would have given anything to meet Eleanor Whitman. Now here she was asking about Sarah's music. "I specialized in romantic period composers," Sarah said. "Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Liszt. But I also played some modern pieces in jazz." Victoria Ashworth looked impressed. "That is quite a range. It takes real skill to move between different styles like that." Mr. Thompson was getting more nervous by the minute. The main course was finished, and he needed Sarah to help serve dessert. But now half of his most important guests were standing around talking to one of his waitresses about music. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Thompson said, trying to get control of the situation, "I am sure Sarah appreciates your interest, but we really need to get back to serving dinner." But Professor Morrison was not ready to stop the conversation. "You know, this is quite remarkable. Here we are, disappointed that we have no music tonight, and we discover that we have a Juilliard-trained pianist right here in the room." Eleanor Whitman's eyes lit up.
That is exactly what I was thinking. Sarah could not believe what was happening.
These people were talking about her like she was a real musician, not just a waitress who used to study music. "Of course," Victoria Ashworth said thoughtfully. "It has been 3 years since she performed. That is a long time to be away from the stage." David Chen finally joined the conversation. "But maybe that does not matter. Real talent does not just disappear." Sarah felt like her heart was going to jump out of her chest. Were they actually suggesting that she should play for them? Professor Morrison turned to Mr. Thompson. "What do you think? Would it be possible for Sarah to play a few pieces for us? It would certainly solve your problem of having no music tonight." Mr. Thompson looked like he was about to faint. "Professor Morrison, I appreciate the suggestion, but Sarah is not a professional performer. She is a waitress. What if she makes a mistake? What if she embarrasses herself, or worse, embarrasses the restaurant? Then we will applaud her for trying," Eleanor Whitman said firmly. "I have supported young musicians my entire life. Some of the greatest performers I know were once nervous young people who just needed someone to give them a chance." Sarah could not speak. Her mouth was dry and her hands were shaking. The idea of playing in front of these people was both the most exciting and the most terrifying thing she could imagine. "I do not know," she finally managed to say. "I have not performed in so long. What if I forget the music? What if my fingers do not work right?" Professor Morrison smiled kindly. "Do you remember your pieces? In your heart, do you still know the music?" Sarah thought about all those nights in her apartment, playing the same pieces over and over. "Yes, I remember them." "Then your fingers will remember too," he said. "Music lives in more than just your mind. It lives in your body, in your soul. 3 years is not long enough to forget something that was truly part of you." The other guests had started to notice the commotion. People were looking over from their tables, wondering what was happening. Some of them had finished their main course and were waiting for dessert, but they seemed more interested in the conversation about music. Mr. Thompson realized that his most important guests were all standing around, waiting to see what would happen. He could not say no to them, even though every part of him was scared that this would go badly. "If the guests would like to hear some music," he said slowly, "and if Sarah feels comfortable playing, then I suppose it would be all right." Sarah felt like the room was spinning. This was really happening. These people really wanted her to play piano for them. "I should warn you," she said quietly. "I am wearing my work uniform. I do not look like a concert pianist," Victoria Ashworth laughed. "My dear, talent has nothing to do with what you are wearing. Some of the most moving performances I have ever heard were from musicians who looked nothing like what people expected." Eleanor Whitman nodded. "What matters is not how you look, but how you play. Music speaks for itself." Professor Morrison gestured toward the beautiful black piano in the corner. "That instrument has been silent all evening. It would be lovely to hear it sing." Sarah looked at the piano. She had walked past it thousands of times, but now it seemed to be calling to her. This was her chance. Maybe her only chance. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will try." The word spread quickly through the dining room. The guests stopped their conversations and turned their chairs to face the piano. Mr. Thompson quickly told the kitchen staff to wait before serving dessert. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Sarah walked slowly toward the piano, feeling like she was walking toward her destiny. Sarah's legs felt weak as she walked toward the piano. Every step seemed to take forever. The dining room, which had been filled with conversation and laughter just minutes before, was now completely quiet. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her every move. When she reached the piano bench, Sarah paused and looked back at the room. All the guests had turned their chairs to face her. Professor Morrison gave her an encouraging nod. Eleanor Whitman was sitting forward in her chair with an excited expression. Even Mr. Thompson, who had looked so worried, was now watching with curious eyes. Sarah sat down on the piano bench and adjusted it to the right height. The Steinway was much larger and more beautiful than her old piano at home. She lifted the cover from the keys and saw the perfect black and white surface that she had dreamed of playing for 3 years. She placed her hands on the keys but did not press them yet. She closed her eyes and tried to calm her racing heart. In her mind, she could hear Professor Chen Li, her old teacher at Juilliard. "Before you play," Professor Chen Li used to say, "you must find the music inside yourself. The piano is just a tool. The real music comes from your heart and your soul." Sarah took a deep breath and let her mind go back to her small apartment and all those nights when she played alone. She thought about the piece she wanted to start with, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was one of the first pieces she had learned to love, and she had played it hundreds of times. Slowly, Sarah pressed the first key. The sound that came from the Steinway was rich and beautiful, much better than anything her old piano could produce. She played the opening notes of the Nocturne, and the melody began to fill the room. At first, her fingers felt stiff and nervous. The keys seemed strange under her hands, but as she continued to play, something magical started to happen. Her fingers began to remember what they were supposed to do. The music started to flow more naturally. The Nocturne was a slow and beautiful piece, perfect for a quiet evening. As Sarah played, she forgot about the people watching her. She forgot about her work uniform and her nervousness. She forgot about everything except the music. The melody danced from her fingers to the keys and then filled the entire room. Each note was clear and perfect. The guests sat in complete silence, listening to every sound. Even the staff in the kitchen had stopped working to listen. Sarah could feel the music taking control of her body. Her hands moved across the keys with confidence now. Her feet worked the pedals to make the sound richer and deeper. This was what she had missed for 3 years. This was what she had been born to do. As the piece continued, Sarah began to add her own feelings to the music. The sadness she had felt for 3 years working at the restaurant and missing her music career came through in the slower parts. But there was also hope in the way she played the brighter sections, as if she was seeing a better future. The guests were amazed by what they were hearing. This was not just good piano playing. This was the work of a real artist. David Chen had completely forgotten about his phone and his business deals. Victoria Ashworth was listening with the expression of someone who had just discovered a precious work of art. Eleanor Whitman had tears in her eyes. Professor Morrison was, nodding his head slightly in time with the music. He had heard thousands of pianists in his long career, and he knew real talent when he heard it. This young woman was not just technically skilled. She had something much more rare, the ability to make people feel the music in their hearts. As the Nocturne reached its most beautiful section, Sarah felt completely free. Her fingers danced across the keys like they were having a conversation with the piano. The music seemed to be coming from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere that had been locked away for 3 years. The other restaurant staff had gathered in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen. The cooks, the dishwashers, and the other waiters and waitresses were all listening with amazed expressions. They had worked with Sarah for years, but they had never known she could do anything like this. Mr. Thompson was standing against the wall with his mouth open. He had hired Sarah 3 years ago because she was reliable and worked hard. He had never imagined that she had this kind of talent hidden inside her. As the piece moved toward its ending, Sarah played with even more feeling. The final notes were soft and gentle like a whisper. When she played the very last note, she held it for a long moment, letting the sound fade slowly into silence. For several seconds after the music stopped, nobody moved. The silence in the room was complete. Sarah sat at the piano with her hands still on the keys, not sure what to do next. Then Professor Morrison started to clap. His applause was joined immediately by Eleanor Whitman, then Victoria Ashworth, then David Chen. Within seconds, every person in the room was clapping. Some of the guests stood up from their chairs. The applause grew louder and louder. Sarah turned around on the piano bench and looked at the crowd. She could not believe what she was seeing. These wealthy, important people were giving her a standing ovation. Mr. Thompson was clapping too, with a huge smile on his face. But the evening was not over. Sarah could see in the faces of the guests that they wanted to hear more. Professor Morrison was gesturing for her to continue playing. "That was beautiful," he called out over the applause. "Please play something else." Sarah turned back to the piano. Her confidence was growing with every second. The Steinway felt comfortable under her hands now, like an old friend. She decided to play something more challenging and exciting. She began Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult and emotional pieces in the classical piano repertoire. This piece was written for a piano and a full orchestra, but Sarah had learned to play both parts herself, switching between the solo melody and the orchestral sections. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff were dramatic and powerful. Sarah's hands moved quickly across the keys, playing the complex rhythms and beautiful melodies that made this piece famous. Her technique was flawless, but more than that, she was putting her whole heart into every note. The guests were even more amazed by this second piece. The Chopin had shown them that Sarah was skilled and sensitive, but the Rachmaninoff showed them that she was also powerful and passionate. This was not just a waitress who could play a little piano. This was a real artist performing at the highest level. As Sarah played, she felt like she was flying. The music carried her away from the restaurant, away from her small apartment, away from all her worries about money and the future. For these few minutes, she was exactly where she belonged, sharing the music she loved with people who could truly appreciate it. The transformation was complete. Sarah Martinez was no longer the invisible waitress. She was a pianist, and she was giving the performance of her life. The final notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 rang through the dining room like thunder. Sarah's hands were moving so fast that they seemed to blur above the keys. The music was powerful and emotional, filling every corner of the room with sound that seemed to come from heaven itself. When Sarah played the last dramatic chord, the silence that followed was even deeper than before. Every person in the room was holding their breath as if they were afraid that making any sound would break the magic spell that Sarah had created. Then, the applause exploded. It was not polite clapping like people do at the end of a business dinner. This was the kind of applause that happens when people have just witnessed something extraordinary. Professor Morrison jumped to his feet so quickly that his chair almost fell over. Eleanor Whitman was clapping so hard that her jewelry was making noise. Victoria Ashworth had tears running down her face. David Chen was not just clapping. He had pulled out his phone and was recording video of Sarah at the piano. He knew that what he had just heard was something special, something that needed to be shared with the world. Incredible, Professor Morrison shouted over the applause. Absolutely incredible. The other guests were saying similar things. People were using words like amazing and unbelievable and brilliant. Some of them were standing and clapping, while others were sitting in their chairs looking stunned. Sarah stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the crowd. She still could not believe what had just happened. For 3 years, she had played music only for herself in her tiny apartment. Now she had just performed for some of the most important people in New York City, and they were giving her the kind of reaction that professional concert pianists dream about. The applause continued for what felt like several minutes. Sarah did not know what to do with her hands or where to look. She had never received this kind of attention before. Even at Juilliard, when she had performed in student concerts, the reaction had never been this strong. Finally, the applause began to die down, and Professor Morrison walked over to Sarah. His face was filled with excitement and amazement. "My dear," he said, taking her hands in his. "That was one of the most beautiful performances I have heard in years. You have extraordinary talent." Eleanor Whitman joined them, still wiping tears from her eyes. "I have been supporting young musicians for 30 years, she said, "and I have never heard anything quite like that. You made me feel every emotion in that music." Victoria Ashworth was nodding in agreement. The technical skill was impressive, but what really moved me was the passion. You did not just play those pieces. You lived them. David Chen approached the group, still holding his phone. "I hope you do not mind," he said to Sarah. But I recorded the last part of your performance. This is something that people need to see and hear." Sarah felt overwhelmed by all the attention. These were people who were used to the best of everything. They had probably heard the greatest musicians in the world perform in the most famous concert halls. And yet they were talking about her performance like it was something truly special. "I cannot believe this is happening," Sarah said quietly. "3 years ago I thought my music career was over. I never imagined I would get to perform for people like you." Professor Morrison looked surprised. "What do you mean your career was over? With talent like yours, your career is just beginning." "But I am just a waitress now," Sarah said. "I dropped out of school. I have student loans to pay and bills to worry about. I cannot afford to be a musician." Eleanor Whitman shook her head firmly. "Nonsense. Talent like yours finds a way. We just need to make sure you get the opportunities you deserve." Victoria Ashworth was already thinking about possibilities. "I host private concerts at my galleries all the time. I would love to have you perform for my guests." David Chen was still excited about the video he had recorded. "If you do not mind me posting this online, I think it could change your life. People need to hear your music." The other guests had started to gather around Sarah and the small group of supporters. Word was spreading quickly through the room about what they had just witnessed. People were introducing themselves to Sarah and asking about her background and her training. Mr. Thompson was standing nearby, listening to all the conversations with amazement. In 30 years of running restaurants, he had never seen anything like this. His waitress had just become the center of attention for the most important dinner he had ever hosted. A woman named Mrs. Patterson, who owned several hotels in the city, approached Sarah with a business proposition. "I would love to hire you to play in the lobby of my flagship hotel. We could arrange regular performances, and the pay would be much better than restaurant work." A man named Dr. Williams, who ran a large charity organization, had another idea. "We host fundraising events throughout the year. We are always looking for talented performers who can help make our events special. Would you be interested in performing at charity galas?" Sarah felt like her head was spinning. In the space of 30 minutes, she had gone from being an invisible waitress to having multiple job offers from some of the wealthiest people in New York. But the most important conversation was still happening with Professor Morrison. He had pulled Sarah aside for a more private discussion. "I want you to know that I am completely serious about what I am going to say," he began. "I am the music director for the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. We are planning a special benefit concert next month to raise money for music education programs in public schools." Sarah's eyes grew wide. The Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra was one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world. "I have been looking for a piano soloist for this concert," Professor Morrison continued. "Someone young and talented who represents the future of classical music. After hearing you play tonight, I know that person is you." Sarah could not speak. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Playing with a major symphony orchestra had been her biggest dream when she was at Juilliard. "I know this is sudden," Professor Morrison said kindly, "but I want to offer you the opportunity to perform as the featured soloist at Lincoln Center. It would be Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece you just played for us." Eleanor Whitman overheard this conversation and clapped her hands together with joy. "James, that is perfect. And I will make sure that everyone who matters in the classical music world is in the audience that night." Victoria Ashworth was already planning the publicity. "This story is incredible. A waitress who becomes a concert soloist. The newspapers will love it." David Chen was thinking about the business possibilities. "With the right marketing and social media strategy, we could turn you into a household name." Sarah felt like she was dreaming. A few hours ago, she had been serving dinner to these people, invisible and unnoticed. Now they were talking about making her famous. "I do not understand," she said finally. "Why are you all being so kind to me? You do not even know me." Professor Morrison smiled. "We know your music, and that tells us everything we need to know about who you are. Music does not lie. When someone plays with the honesty and passion that you just showed us, it reveals their true character." Eleanor Whitman nodded. "We have all been searching for something authentic in a world that is often fake and superficial. Your performance tonight was real. It came from your heart." The evening was far from over, and Sarah could see that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. The rest of the evening passed like a wonderful dream that Sarah never wanted to end. After her performance, the dinner completely changed from a formal business event to an excited celebration of music and talent. The guests forgot about their dessert and spent the next 2 hours talking with Sarah about music, her dreams, and her future. Business cards seemed to appear from everywhere. Sarah's uniform pockets were soon filled with contact information from some of the most powerful people in New York City. Each person had ideas about how they could help her career, and many of them wanted to hire her for their own events. Mrs. Patterson, the hotel owner, wrote down her phone number and told Sarah to call her the next day. "I am serious about offering you a position at my hotel," she said. "You could play in our lobby every evening, and I guarantee the salary would be at least 3 times what you make here." Dr. Williams, who organized charity events, had an even bigger offer. "I coordinate fundraising galas for 8 different organizations. If you could perform at just half of our events, you would make more money in 1 month than most people make in a year." But the most exciting opportunity was still the one Professor Morrison had offered. Playing with the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra at Lincoln Center was the kind of chance that most musicians only dream about. Sarah kept touching the business card he had given her, afraid that it might disappear. David Chen was already working on the social media strategy. He had edited the video he recorded and posted it on his personal accounts, which had millions of followers. "By tomorrow morning," he told Sarah, "hundreds of thousands of people will have heard your music." Eleanor Whitman was making phone calls right there in the restaurant. She was contacting music critics, other musicians, and wealthy patrons who supported the arts. "Everyone needs to know about this young woman," she kept saying. Victoria Ashworth was planning an art gallery event specifically around Sarah's music. "I want to combine visual art with your piano performance," she explained. "It will be an evening that brings together all forms of artistic expression." Mr. Thompson was watching all of this with complete amazement. When he had hired Sarah 3 years ago, he thought he was getting a reliable waitress. He never imagined that she would become the star of the most important evening in his restaurant's history. The other staff members were equally shocked. Sarah's fellow waiters and waitresses kept coming over to congratulate her during breaks in their work. The cooks had never heard anything like her performance. Even the dishwashers were talking about the amazing music that had filled the restaurant. "I cannot believe you never told us you could play like that," said Maria, another waitress who had worked with Sarah for 2 years. "Why did you keep it a secret?" Sarah did not know how to answer. "I guess I did not think it mattered anymore. I thought that part of my life was over." "Are you crazy?" Maria laughed. "If I could play piano like that, I would tell everyone I met." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, each person made sure to say goodbye to Sarah personally. They treated her like a celebrity, asking for photos and promising to stay in touch. Professor Morrison was one of the last to leave. He pulled Sarah aside for a final conversation. "I want you to understand how serious I am about the symphony concert," he said. "This is not just a nice gesture. I genuinely believe you are ready to perform at that level." Sarah still felt overwhelmed by the offer. "But it has been 3 years since I performed professionally. What if I am not good enough? What if I disappoint you?" Professor Morrison shook his head. "After what I heard tonight, I have no doubts about your abilities. You have not lost your talent. If anything, the experiences you have had over the past 3 years have made your playing more mature and emotional." He handed her another business card with his personal phone number. "Call me tomorrow, and we will start planning your comeback." When the last guest finally left, Sarah was alone in the dining room with Mr. Thompson and the other staff. The restaurant looked the same as it had at the beginning of the evening, but everything felt completely different. Mr. Thompson approached Sarah with a strange expression on his face. For a moment she worried that he was angry about all the attention she had received. "Sarah," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology. For 3 years I have treated you like just another employee. I never took the time to learn about who you really are or what your dreams were." Sarah was surprised by his honesty. "You do not need to apologize, Mr. Thompson. You gave me a job when I needed one." "But I could have done more," he said. "If I had known about your musical talent, I could have found ways to use it. We could have had live music here every night." He paused and looked at the piano in the corner. "I have a proposition for you. I know you are going to be very busy with all these new opportunities, but would you consider playing here once a week? Maybe on Friday nights? I would pay you extra, of course, and it would bring in more customers." Sarah smiled. The idea of returning to the Golden Crown as a performer instead of just a waitress felt like completing a circle. "I would like that," she said. This place is where everything changed for me. I will never forget tonight. As Sarah changed out of her work uniform for the last time, she thought about how different her life was going to be. When she had woken up that morning, she was just a waitress with secret dreams. Now she had offers to perform at some of the most prestigious venues in the city. The drive home to her small apartment in Brooklyn felt different too. Instead of being tired and discouraged like she usually was after work, Sarah felt energized and excited. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications as David Chen's video of her performance spread across social media. When she finally got home, Sarah sat down at her old piano and played a few notes. The sound was thin and tinny compared to the beautiful Steinway she had played at the restaurant. But this little piano had kept her dreams alive during the hardest years of her life. She picked up the business cards from her pocket and spread them out on top of the piano. Professor Morrison, Eleanor Whitman, Victoria Ashworth, David Chen, Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Williams, and several others. Each card represented a different possibility for her future. Sarah's phone rang. She did not recognize the number, but she answered it anyway. "Hello, is this Sarah Martinez?" asked a woman's voice. "Yes, this is Sarah. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I am a talent agent and I represent classical musicians. I just saw a video of your performance tonight, and I would very much like to talk with you about representation." Sarah sat down heavily on her bed. Even talent agents were calling her now. "I am sorry," Sarah said, "but this is all very new to me. I do not know anything about agents or how the music business works." "That is exactly why you need someone like me," Jennifer said. "With the right guidance, you could have a very successful career. Would you be available to meet with me tomorrow?" After she hung up the phone, Sarah looked around her tiny apartment. By this time next year, she might be living somewhere completely different. She might be traveling around the world, performing in famous concert halls. The life she had given up 3 years ago was suddenly possible again. But first, she had some phone calls to make. Professor Morrison was waiting to hear from her about the symphony concert. Eleanor Whitman wanted to introduce her to other people in the classical music world. Victoria Ashworth was planning an art gallery event. Mrs. Patterson had a job offer that could change her financial situation immediately. Sarah's new life was about to begin, and she could hardly wait to see where the music would take her. Sarah woke up the next morning to the sound of her phone ringing. She had fallen asleep with Professor Morrison's business card in her hand, and for a moment she wondered if the previous night had been just a wonderful dream. But the phone kept ringing, and when she answered it, everything became real again. "Sarah, this is Eleanor Whitman. I hope I'm not calling too early, but I have been up all night thinking about your performance. I have some very exciting news." Sarah sat up in bed, trying to wake up completely. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman. What kind of news?" "I have been making phone calls since I got home last night," Eleanor said with excitement in her voice. "I have spoken to the directors of 3 major concert halls, 2 record labels, and the music critics from both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Everyone wants to meet you." Sarah's head was spinning. "Record labels? Music critics?"
I do not understand. My dear, what happened last night was extraordinary.
"David Chen's video of your performance has already been viewed over 1,000,000 times. People are calling you the mystery pianist and the waitress virtuoso. You are becoming famous." After hanging up with Eleanor, Sarah checked her phone and could not believe what she saw. David Chen's video had indeed gone viral. There were thousands of comments from people around the world saying how beautiful her music was. Some people were asking who she was and where they could hear her play again. Her phone rang again. This time it was Professor Morrison. "Sarah, I hope you have had time to think about my offer," he said. "I need to know if you are interested in performing with the symphony, because I have to start planning the concert program." "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "Yes, I would love to perform with the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra." "Wonderful." Professor Morrison sounded delighted. "Can you come to Lincoln Center this afternoon? I want you to meet the other musicians and try playing with a full orchestra. We need to make sure you are comfortable before the actual performance." Sarah agreed to meet him at 2 o'clock. After hanging up, she realized she had no idea what to wear to a symphony rehearsal. Her waitress uniform was definitely not appropriate, but she did not own anything fancy enough for Lincoln Center. Her phone rang again. It was Victoria Ashworth. "Sarah, I have been thinking about your story all night. I want to feature you in a special exhibition at my gallery. We will call it Hidden Talents, the Art of Unexpected Beauty. You will perform while people view paintings and sculptures that represent the theme of discovering something wonderful in unexpected places. That sounds amazing, Sarah said, but I should tell you that I do not have much experience performing in galleries. Perfect, Victoria laughed. The best art comes from people who are willing to try new things. Can you come to my gallery on Monday? I want to show you the space and discuss the details. The phone calls continued throughout the morning. Mrs. Patterson called to confirm the job offer at her hotel. Dr. Williams wanted to schedule Sarah for 3 different charity events. The talent agent, Jennifer Walsh, called again to set up a meeting for the following week. By noon, Sarah had a notebook full of appointments and opportunities. Her calendar, which had been empty except for work shifts at the Golden Crown, was now completely filled with meetings, rehearsals, and potential performances. But first, she needed clothes for her meeting at Lincoln Center. Sarah took the subway to Manhattan and found a store that sold professional-looking outfits that she could afford. She bought a simple black dress and low-heeled shoes that would be appropriate for a classical music setting. When Sarah arrived at Lincoln Center, she felt like she was entering a dream. The famous building had been home to some of the greatest musicians in history. She had visited here as a student at Juilliard, but always as someone in the audience or watching from the back of rehearsals. Now she was here as a featured performer. Professor Morrison met her at the stage door and led her through hallways lined with photographs of legendary conductors and soloists. I want you to meet some of the orchestra members, he said. They are very excited to work with you. The musicians were setting up for their afternoon rehearsal when Professor Morrison brought Sarah onto the stage. She had never seen a full symphony orchestra up close like this. There were nearly 100 musicians with violins, cellos, flutes, trumpets, and dozens of other instruments. Everyone, Professor Morrison called out, I would like you to meet Sarah Martinez, our piano soloist for the benefit concert. The musicians looked up from their instruments and began to applaud. Sarah was embarrassed by the attention, but she could see that they were genuinely happy to meet her. The concertmaster, a woman named Lisa Chen, came over to introduce herself. I saw the video of your performance last night, she said. It was absolutely beautiful. We are honored to have you perform with us. Other musicians joined the conversation, asking Sarah about her background and her experience with Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She was surprised by how friendly and welcoming they were. She had expected them to be skeptical about working with someone who was not an established professional. The thing about Rachmaninoff, said the principal cellist, is that it requires not just technical skill but real emotional depth. From what I heard in that video, you definitely have both. Professor Morrison led Sarah to the piano in the center of the stage. It was another beautiful Steinway, even larger than the one at the Golden Crown. Would you like to try playing with the orchestra? He asked. We can run through a few sections of the concerto to see how it feels. Sarah sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench. She looked out at the rows of musicians waiting for her to begin. This was what she had dreamed about during all those lonely nights in her apartment. Let us start with the opening of the first movement, Professor Morrison said as he picked up his conductor's baton. Sarah placed her hands on the keys and nodded to show she was ready. Professor Morrison raised his baton, and the orchestra began to play the dramatic opening chords of the concerto. When it was time for the piano to enter, Sarah began to play. The feeling of playing with a full orchestra was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The sound surrounded her from every direction. The violin soared above her melody, while the cellos and basses provided a rich foundation underneath. The brass instruments added power and drama, while the woodwinds contributed delicate colors and textures. As they played together, Sarah felt like she was part of something much larger than herself. Each musician was playing their own part, but together they were creating something beautiful and unified. This was why she had fallen in love with classical music in the first place. When they finished the section, the orchestra members were smiling and nodding their approval. Professor Morrison looked delighted. That was excellent, he said. You have a natural ability to listen to the orchestra and blend with the other musicians. That is not something that can be taught. They rehearsed for another hour, working on different sections of the concerto. With each part they played, Sarah felt more confident and comfortable. The orchestra members were patient and supportive, offering suggestions and encouragement. After the rehearsal, Several musicians came over to talk with Sarah. They shared stories about their own careers and gave her advice about performing as a soloist. "The most important thing," said the principal violinist, "is to trust yourself and enjoy the experience. The audience can tell when a performer is having fun on stage." As Sarah left Lincoln Center that afternoon, she felt like she was walking on air. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from serving tables to rehearsing with one of the world's finest orchestras. Her phone was buzzing with more messages and calls. Eleanor Whitman had set up meetings with 2 different record labels. Victoria Ashworth had confirmed the gallery performance for the following month. Mrs. Patterson wanted to start the hotel performances as soon as possible, but the most surprising call came from Mr. Thompson at the Golden Crown. "Sarah," he said, "I have been getting phone calls all day from people who saw the video of your performance. They want to know when you will be playing here again. I think we should make this a regular thing. How would you feel about performing here every Friday night?" Sarah smiled as she walked through the streets of Manhattan. The Golden Crown, where her musical rebirth had begun, wanted her to come back as a featured performer. It seemed like the perfect way to honor the place where everything had changed. "I would love that, Mr. Thompson," she said. "The Golden Crown will always be special to me." As she rode the subway back to Brooklyn, Sarah thought about how quickly her life was changing. 3 days ago, she had been worried about paying her rent and her student loans. Now she had more opportunities than she could handle, and the financial stress that had controlled her life for 3 years was finally starting to disappear. Her phone rang one more time. It was her mother, calling from the hospital where she was receiving treatment. "Sarah, honey," her mother said, "your friend Maria called me and told me about what happened at the restaurant last night. She said you played piano for some very important people." Sarah had been so busy with all the new opportunities that she had not had time to call her mother and tell her the news. "Mom," Sarah said, "I think things are finally going to get better for us." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the green room backstage at Carnegie Hall looking at herself in the mirror. She was wearing an elegant black evening gown that Eleanor Whitman had helped her choose for this special night. Her hair was styled professionally, and she wore the pearl necklace that Victoria Ashworth had given her as a good luck gift. Tonight was Sarah's debut solo recital at one of the most famous concert halls in the world. The same people who had discovered her talent that night at the Golden Crown were now sitting in the front rows waiting to hear her perform again. But this time she was not a surprised waitress playing an impromptu concert. She was a professional pianist with her name on the marquee outside. Sarah's life had changed so completely over the past 6 months that sometimes she had to remind herself it was all real. The student loans that had seemed impossible to pay off were now manageable thanks to the money she was earning from performances. Her mother's medical bills were caught up for the first time in years. Sarah had even been able to move out of her tiny apartment in Brooklyn and rent a larger place in Manhattan with a beautiful baby grand piano. The concert with the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra had been a huge success. The audience had given her 3 standing ovations, and the music critics had written reviews calling her a major new talent and the most exciting young pianist to emerge in years. The recording of that performance had been released as an album, and it was selling well both in stores and online. Mrs. Patterson's hotel performances had become so popular that people made reservations weeks in advance just to hear Sarah play. Victoria Ashworth's gallery concerts had introduced Sarah to a whole new audience of art, lovers who appreciated the connection between visual and musical beauty. Dr. Williams had featured Sarah at so many charity events that she had helped raise over $2 million for various causes, but Sarah had not forgotten her roots. Every Friday night she returned to the Golden Crown to perform for dinner guests. Mr. Thompson had renovated part of the restaurant to create a proper performance space, and these weekly concerts had become some of the most sought-after reservations in the city. Sarah insisted on keeping these performances intimate and personal, often telling the story of how her musical career had been reborn in that very room. A knock on the dressing room door interrupted Sarah's thoughts. Professor Morrison entered carrying a large bouquet of flowers. "These are from the orchestra," he said with a smile. "They wanted you to know they are all here tonight to support you." Sarah was touched by the gesture. Working with the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra had taught her so much about music and performance. The musicians had become not just colleagues but friends who continued to encourage and guide her career. "Are you nervous?" Professor Morrison asked. Sarah considered the question. "A little," she admitted. "But it is a different kind of nervousness than I felt that night at the restaurant. Then I was afraid I might embarrass myself. Tonight I am nervous because I want to give the audience something beautiful and meaningful." Professor Morrison nodded with understanding. "That is the difference between amateur and professional nerves. You have grown so much as a performer over these past months." Another knock came at the door. This time it was Eleanor Whitman, accompanied by David Chen and Victoria Ashworth. "We wanted to wish you luck," Eleanor said. "Although I know you do not need it. You are going to be wonderful tonight." David Chen was carrying his phone as usual. "I hope you do not mind, but I am planning to stream part of tonight's concert online. Your fans from around the world have been asking when they can see you perform again." Sarah was still amazed by the fact that she had fans around the world. The video of her first performance had now been viewed over 50 million times, and people from dozens of countries had sent her messages of support and encouragement. Victoria Ashworth handed Sarah a small gift box. "This is something I thought you might like to have tonight." Inside the box was a silver bracelet with a small piano charm. Engraved on the back were the words, "From hidden talent to shining star." "Thank you," Sarah said, fastening the bracelet around her wrist. "All of you have given me so much more than just opportunities. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself." As her friends left to take their seats in the audience, Sarah spent a few more minutes alone, preparing for the performance. She thought about the program she had chosen for tonight's recital. It included the Chopin Nocturne and the Rachmaninoff that she had played that first night, but also new pieces that represented her growth as an artist. She had added works by female composers who had been overlooked by history, pieces by young contemporary musicians, and even a jazz arrangement that showed her versatility. This concert was not just about playing beautiful music. It was about using her platform to share different voices and perspectives. A stage manager appeared at the door. "Ms. Martinez, it is time." Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. As she reached the wings, she could hear the buzz of conversation from the sold-out audience. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the beautiful concert hall filled with people who had come to hear her play. In the front rows, she spotted the familiar faces of her supporters from the Golden Crown. Professor Morrison was sitting with the orchestra musicians who had become her friends. Eleanor Whitman was next to several record company executives who were interested in working with Sarah on future projects. Victoria Ashworth had brought a group of art collectors and gallery owners who appreciated the connection between different forms of creativity. But Sarah also saw new faces in the audience. There were young music students who saw her as proof that dreams could come true even after setbacks. There were working people who related to her story of struggling to make ends meet while pursuing art. There were families who had been inspired by her journey from invisibility to recognition. As Sarah walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. She had performed for thousands of people over the past 6 months, but Carnegie Hall felt different. This was where the greatest pianists in history had played. Now she was joining that tradition. Sarah sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench just as she had done that night at the Golden Crown. But everything else was different now. She was no longer the nervous waitress hoping not to embarrass herself. She was a confident artist ready to share her passion with an audience that had come specifically to hear her music. She began with the Chopin Nocturne, the same piece that had started her transformation 6 months earlier. As the familiar melody filled the concert hall, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The years of struggle and financial worry had not been wasted. They had given her music a depth and emotional honesty that came from real experience. As she played, Sarah could see people in the audience closing their eyes and letting the music wash over them. This was why she had fallen in love with piano in the first place. Music had the power to transport people, to make them feel less alone, to remind them that beauty existed in the world even during difficult times. When she finished the Chopin, the applause was warm and enthusiastic. Sarah moved on to the other pieces in her program, each one telling a different part of her story or exploring a different aspect of human emotion. The Rachmaninoff came at the end of the first half, and Sarah played it with even more power and passion than she had that first night. The audience was completely silent during the performance, hanging on every note. When she played the final dramatic chords, the standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. During intermission, Sarah returned to her dressing room to find it filled with flowers and congratulatory messages. Her phone had dozens of text messages from friends, family, and colleagues around the world who were watching the live stream of the concert. One message made her smile more than all the others. It was from Maria, her former coworker at the Golden Crown. "Girl, I always knew you were special, but this is incredible. You are making all of us so proud." The second half of the concert featured the more contemporary and diverse pieces that Sarah had chosen. She introduced each piece to the audience, explaining why she had selected it and what it meant to her. This personal connection with the audience was something that had developed naturally over her months of performing. Music should not be something that only certain people can understand or appreciate, she told the audience. It should speak to everyone, regardless of their background or education. That is why I try to include different styles and voices in my performances. When Sarah played her final piece of the evening, the audience knew they had witnessed something special. This was not just a piano recital. It was a celebration of talent, perseverance, and the power of music to change lives. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and Sarah had to return to the stage 3 times to acknowledge the applause. As she took her final bow, she looked out at the audience and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. After the concert, there was a reception where Sarah had the chance to meet many of the people who had attended. She spoke with young musicians who were inspired by her story, with music lovers who had been moved by her performance, and with industry professionals who wanted to work with her on future projects.